I did what most self-respecting women of my age do when you don't know what to do. I started a threesome, and their names were Ben and Jerry. Right? We experiment, we fail, we observe, we go again, right? And if we're not failing, then we're not learning. And if we're not learning, then we're not growing. When I talk about it, I do feel a bit cliched in the I nearly died situation, you know. I'm like, oh, she's one of those speakers. She nearly died and then she had an epiphany. Spoiler alert, I survived.
My guest for this episode is Gitanjali Trevorrow-Seymour. Like me, Gitanjali started her working life as an actress until her career took an unexpected segue into financial services. Over the course of 15 years, she rose into leadership roles, helping her organisation and team navigate the challenges of the global financial crisis. Leaving her corporate career behind, she's now an award-winning executive coach and has been recognised as one of the UK's top 100 female entrepreneurs. As founder and CEO of High Definition U, Gitanjali and her team now work with leaders of global organisations to achieve their mission of creating a world full of Possiblists. Gitanjali and I have collaborated for several years now, and I wanted to share her infectious energy and curiosity with you on the podcast. If you enjoy what you hear, please leave a review, like, comment and subscribe. It would mean the world to me, and it will help the show reach as many people as possible. You don't want to miss this. Enjoy. Gitanjali, welcome to the show. My first question for you. In life, what's the most important thing that you've ever had to pitch for?
I mean, my mind immediately goes to business, right? So I was in banking, so I was not a banker. I just want that to be clear right now to anybody that says, I was not responsible for the global financial crisis. I was not one of those, well, wanker bankers, as we might say in Australia. But, you know, there was plenty of things that I had to pitch for. I was actually in a sales role originally in my career. But more recently, probably in terms of my business, there's been, you know, pitching in a more traditional way for, you know, business, RFPs, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Like that's where my mind goes, Dom, to actually pitching for business, the reality of pitching for business.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, we can't shy away from that. I think it's always interesting to hear people's answers to that initial question, because there are so many things in life that we're continually pitching for, and some of it's on a kind of micro level, on a day-to-day, you know, can I get the barista to deliver me the coffee in the way that I actually want it, through to, you know, life-changing decisions about deciding to move career or, you know, move to the other side of the world. And there have been many of those things in your journey, so we'll dig into some of those a little bit later on. In terms of...
Can I add one more thing? The thing that occurred to me actually as you were talking is, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is like, what is it to actually pitch? Like, what is pitching? Not in a like break down a pitch book, but you know, you and I share a background in acting before we got into this work, and when I've thought about that more recently, I used to think as an actor that I was pitching myself, and now through my work, you know, what it actually is, you know, my work as chief possibilist, it's like, oh, actually, no, that's where I was going wrong. I thought I needed to pitch myself to agents. I needed to pitch myself, you know, in an audition. And that's, and when I wasn't pitching myself, when I was actually just within myself and when I was caring less, you know, which unsurprisingly is an element of being a possibilist now, that's actually when I showed up best. So actually the idea of pitching and pitching myself was getting in my way. And it happens even now today. You know, I've got to pitch us in the best light. You know, actually it's the thing that, you know, stops me from being the best version of myself, not to sound too cheesy, but if I could get in the time machine, go back, you know, preferably with Michael J. Fox in the DeLorean, I tell myself, like, you don't need to pitch yourself.
Yeah. And I think the kind of distinction there is that kind of presence piece and that connection piece. It's about really kind of being in the room, in the moment with the person that you're engaging with, whether we're talking a business pitch here or an audition for an actor, rather than that kind of needy energy, which is like, you know, please buy my stuff, please like me, please appreciate who I am. Let's flip this then. So if those kind of business pitches are really, you know, seminal in terms of moving things forward. Is there anything that you sit back and reflect on and go, oh, that got away, I'd have loved to have done that at any part of your career? Is there a pitch that you, if you could get in the time machine, you'd go back and have a proper go for?
No, I mean, nothing comes to mind. That's probably because I have done so much work on like not going backwards to try and figure it out. And I lived for a really, really long time, and I mean decades, in the regret machine of I should have done this, I shouldn't have done that, I should do this, I shouldn't do that. And now I talk about it as shooting all over yourself, like it's a filthy, dirty habit. Stop doing it. So actually, it is truly a struggle for me to think about what I would go back and do differently. I mean, of course, in just a transactional way, there's opportunities that didn't land, for us. But I am really, more than ever, when I look at how we are actually designed, I'm like, no, it is the unfolding nature of the experience that means that is not part of the experience. And I was saying this to someone yesterday, actually, that memories are designed to fade for a reason, right? Not traditionally, as well as, scientifically, like if we look at how the brain is structured, we're not actually meant to remember. I mean, you have kids, like if we could remember everything in all its explicit detail, then, procreation wouldn't happen. I remember having my first one, right? And that memory faded, and so then we had another one. So just in that way, it's quite interesting to me, is like, oh yeah, it's designed to fade. Unfortunately, and that's a separate conversation, the whole advent of social media means that we're continually reminded of things that we wish that we could forget, and we're not talking about it.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I suppose with the advent of digital photography and video and everything, we're holding on to experiences that 30, 40 years ago would have been a very distant memory, and may have still been there, but not in all of their kind of technicolor glory. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
maybe dig into that.
Yeah. How painstaking it is whenever you get the cloud storage full, or storage is full, you have to delete some photos. It's like, oh God, what will I do if I delete those? Who will I be if I delete that video of when my 9-year-old was 2.5 and running around the park without his pants on? And okay, I think I can move on from that.
Let it go. So, I mean, you're a hugely successful coach and speaker. You're on a mission to create a world full of possibilists. But before we dive into what you're doing now, can you take me back? So what is your story? What did you want to be when you were a kid?
Oh, I had one singular dream, and that was to be an actress. And I didn't know that was the dream originally, because I didn't actually know, Dom, that you could be paid to do what I loved to do. So I started when I was 6. And thank goodness, my mother, just incredible woman in the world. We went to a local theatre company. I don't know if you've ever been to, children's theatre. And we
Thankfully, were not very often. No.
not often. And we were there, and I often tell the story of being there. And it was my sister's birthday, and she was absolutely terrified as they came up the aisles, because children's theatre, it's very interactive, right? And she was just shaking. She did not want them to choose her, and I was like, choose me, pick me. And so I didn't know that was acting, like to be an actress was a thing. It was just that there was something so compelling to me that I wanted to be a part of that. And at 6, I didn't have the lexicon for what that was. And then as I got older and continued, to do children's theatre and then amateur youth theatre, etc., that type of thing, I still remember the day that I realized that people got paid to be an actor. And I literally I wanted to walk along the street and just tap people on the shoulder and say, do you know that you can be paid to be an actor? Like, why would anybody want to be anything else in the world, was what was resonating in my mind. And so for, many years until I, and this is kind of part of the story of why I'm a possibilist now, is until I became afraid. Until I started to think, oh gosh, it's hard. Like, not many people make it as an actor. Like, until the stories that I started telling myself became louder than the truth of who I was in my mind.
Yeah. So this was in Australia. Was there a kind of big professional acting scene there? I mean, when I think about my childhood, we grew up on the Australian soaps and all of that sort of thing, but it doesn't strike me as that there's back then that there was a huge amount of kind of film industry or potentially even kind of a strong theatre industry outside of sort of Sydney and maybe Perth.
I like the nebulous reference to back then, like back then, kids, in the 50s when I was
yeah.
keeping that vague, Dom, thank you. No, I mean, there wasn't a huge, but I do remember saying to my mum, and I guess this has, when I look at, what is my fuel, is if I'm going to do something, there was an idea of like, well, why wouldn't it be like everything? And so I did want to go to Hollywood, and I did want to win an Oscar, and I did want to be the best that there was, right? And I remember saying to Mum, I'm going to go to Hollywood, like I want to have this career. And I remember her saying, well, stay here. Like, not even to stay here. She was never directive like that. She was like, do this, don't do that. But there was this conversation around, well, here you could be a big fish in a little pond, right? Versus going over to the States and, being the proverbial little fish. And so, yes, at that time, it wasn't a huge industry. And in fact, I went to drama school in New Zealand, which at the time was an even smaller industry. And so when I moved back to Australia and I moved to Sydney, it was like going back to the big smoke of like, oh, actually, there's many more opportunities over there. And it's one of the reasons, actually, that I was so excited when I moved to London originally, because I was still trying to be an actress then, whilst still doing banking. It's a natural segue. But there's
Obviously.
so much theatre here. Yeah, so much theatre here, which there just wasn't in the same way. Like, it seemed every pub had a theatre above it. And, that was really exciting for me and compelling as part of the, why would I move? Why? But you're Australian. Why would you want to live in London?
So when did those kind of voices start to kick in and challenge your belief about what you were able to do? When did that doubt start to creep?
I remember really specifically being a teenager and being part of a youth theatre group. And as part of that, we needed to audition for the main roles in the show. And it was the first time that I understood that there was competition, that actually it wasn't what it had been really until then, which was play. Right? It was like showing up, it was play, it was a play, it was scripted. So it wasn't, like we were just kind of improving. But then I was like, and that was the first time I remember thinking, will I be good enough to get what I want, which was the main role. And then when spoiler alert, did not win the main role, that was the beginning of like, okay. So what I started to believe was that sometimes I'm not going to be good enough. And I accidentally, which I can say now because, in all the work and research I've done around human behavioral change and who I am as a possibilist, it's like, I accidentally linked those things, that the result of that audition had something to do with who I actually was. Right?
Yeah.
And so it went from there, it just amplified. And, I continued to attach all sorts of evidence to that then felt very, very real. And then I'm still trying to navigate this dream and at the same time trying to do something sensible. I was very privileged. I went to, not privileged as in grew up privileged, but privileged to go to a really great school. It was an all-girls private school. And, you didn't, of the three things that you put down that you were going to be in the world, actress was not one of them. So I wasn't so busy, I was going to be a lawyer because I'm like, well, maybe I'll be a barrister in court and that's a real job and that has, kudos and I'll still be able to, act. And then I studied psychology. So this was all sort of bundled up at the same time around, trying to carve a way that was serious and sensible and had more perhaps perceived prowess and status behind it. And then this
the lawyer piece is fascinating, because when I was 17 and applying for drama schools, that was I never explored it, but that was the alternate route in my mind. Back in the day, you could go and do a degree, and then you could do a second degree, and you'd still get funding for it. So I always kind of thought, well, if the acting career doesn't work out, I'll be a barrister, because essentially you're just standing up and acting in front of an audience.
I mean, how hard can that be?
A lot harder than we think.
Yes, and like, it's not just run Pole of the Bailey. I'm like, oh, okay, a little bit more involved.
Absolutely. So you made the decision to come over to the UK. I mean, a lot of people travel between Australia and the UK, and that is a kind of familiar route of growing up and experiencing the world. But it's still a big step to leave home and travel to literally the other side of the world. So what was the catalyst for doing that?
Well, you can get a working holiday visa. So it was very transactional in a way. You can get a working holiday visa up to a certain point as an Australian, and I wanted to take advantage of that. My mum had moved here a couple of years before, so she was already here, and I could kind of have somewhere to land. And then there was also, I had grown up in theatre, and I was, in my mind, I was like, oh, I can do both. I can travel, because I've always had this wanderlust. And that was actually one of the reasons why I was so excited to be an actress, when I figured out, oh my gosh, you get paid to do this, and they pay you to do it in all sorts of locations. So I'm like, oh, okay, let me get there, and then I'll have a bit of a play. And I remember at the time when I was leaving Sydney, my agent said, you've got 6 months. And then you'll have to start again. I was never anyone, right? I didn't even feature on the blip of the landscape of what it was to be a successful actress. But I at least knew some of the casting agents, etc. And he said, 6 months. Which, interestingly, my agent in New Zealand, when I moved back to Australia, said the same thing. And so in my mind, I did life for a lot of years in 6-month slots and blocks. Like, okay, 6 months. And then the 6-month mark came, and I was still here. And then another 6 months. And I'm like, oh, I'll give it another 6 months. And that was 20 years ago, Dom. 20 years ago. So that's a lot of 6-month blocks.
That is, yeah. So you ended up in the world of corporate finance, but you don't strike me as someone who does things by halves. So, with relatively little experience in that world, you carve out a serious career for yourself. What was it like being, a female in a very male-dominated environment?
Well, two things. What's interesting is you said in a very serious world. A very serious career. One of the things that I realized is I was relatively successful and, got promoted, was leading teams, and took on some pretty big roles, because actually I didn't take it too seriously. And when I did, I was back into what happened when I took my acting career really seriously, and something was at stake. Something was always at stake, right? And actually, when it wasn't for me in my banking career, then it felt effortless, and things happened effortlessly. So that was the first thing. Female in a male-dominated environment is interesting because, now people say, oh, what do you do? Which, I love that question. And I used to say, oh, we work predominantly, with women in leadership in male-dominated environments. And someone said to me, it was about 2.5 years ago, they're like, what isn't a male-dominated environment? As in industry. And I was like, that is an excellent question. I think obviously there's a very perceived machismo that goes with that.
Finance, alpha approach,
that you might not get in other industries. How was it? It was there were really, really cliched, obvious, just discrimination and poor behavior in terms of kind of the male perception of women in that industry, and expectations of how you should look. For example, it was and I'm going back, I left 11 years ago. It's changed now and continues to evolve. But so there was that. And then, what was really interesting to me, and it's a conversation that I continue to have, is because of, this is a theory that I've, surmised over the years since, is because the number of women in senior roles, particularly, because when we look at the data actually at an earlier level, it's relatively on par, in senior roles is so few, and that still remains today, is interestingly what happened was I found women were highly critical of me. And so, for example, I remember taking on, it was a newly formed role. It was the head of EMEA, so head of a whole region for onboarding. And I'd been in the role probably a couple of months, I think. And I heard on the grapevine that people thought I had got that role because I had slept with the MD. Now, as soon as I heard this, I went into his office, and I knew him personally. I knew his wife, I knew his daughter. And I said to him, this is what people are saying. And he had the biggest grin on his face. And I said, let's call him Dom. Dom, what? Like, how on earth can you be smirking right now? What is making you smile about that? He's like, well, it's good for my reputation. And I was like, what? And then I discovered it was women that were spreading that rumor. So there were so many dynamics, and I think we can be very sort of generalized in our assumptions about, and it's again one of the reasons why clean curiosity as part of being a possibilist is like remove the assumptions. Yeah. Actually, and what is it that I see really clearly from there? So that was confronting, very confronting. Really, because again, it made me think, am I enough? Am I good enough? Do people believe that I should be in this seat? Is that, like, it made me question myself, which I just do so little of these days. The self-doubt, the self-criticism, the questioning of if I'm good enough, the trying to make it look like I don't, care, the whole conversation about being confident in that environment or any other environment, because as you know, I'm on a mission to ban that word. So yeah, it was complex, as is everything in life. It's just, it becomes less complex when we come from a place of, as we talked about at the beginning, of being really present in this moment.
Sorry to interrupt, but before we continue with the episode, I've got a favour to ask. I'm on a mission to get this podcast in the hands of as many people as possible. So if you found what you've heard so far valuable, please, please, please like, comment, rate and subscribe. These things make a huge difference to our reach. And if you're open to it, if you happen to know just one person, someone who, just like you, would benefit from listening to these conversations, then please share the podcast with them. Let's get on with it. So when did you start to, challenge some of these mindsets and beliefs, and what was the thread that led you from, the corporate world into then working as a coach with corporate clients? How did that evolve?
Totally accidentally, as most things have done in my life. So I had this really, interesting career, and all of a sudden, as it often is, my role, I was head of EMEA again for another area of the bank, and all of the heads of the regions were cut and everything was centralized back to the US. And so I found myself at a certain age, just thinking, oh gosh, I better grow up and get a haircut and get a real job. Like, how did this accidentally happen? Because what had happened actually, a few years earlier, I remember being on the bus coming back from Canary Wharf, and I was calling my mum and I was in tears, and it was many, many years ago. It was over a boy. Yes, I was crying over a boy and thinking, should I move back to Australia? The should have, would have, could have, didn't. And I remember saying, I could get an Asian again, and, I haven't made it as an actress here. And I remember my mum just saying, when are you going to realize, and these were her words, that you're a successful businesswoman? And I was like, wait, who? Me? Like, oh, and so that actually, I had started to realize, and then it felt like, oh, okay, no, you're not that anymore. And so then I am telling you, I did what most self-respecting women of my age do when you don't know what to do. I started a threesome with two men, and their names were Ben and Jerry. And we stayed in bed, Ben, Jerry, and I. And their boyfriend, now husband, would come home and he's like, still in bed with Ben and Jerry? Like, yep, one more tub of Ben and Jerry will get me through this. So that threesome lasted a good year, where I was just in the depths of absolute loss of who I was, loss of confidence, which is also, again, why I'm on this mission to ban the C word and open up a whole other way of thinking as a possibilist, because I thought that I needed confidence in order to do the next thing, which was accidentally holding me back from doing anything. And so at one point, so I had thought that I would be an FX trader online, right? I'm like, okay, I can stay in my pajamas. I can do this FX trading. I kind of know how to read the reports. I'll focus on GBP AUD, like Australian dollar pound. I'll look, and there I was, like, waiting for the non-payroll data to come out of the farm data to come out of the US. And at one point, Tim just came home, and I was like that puppy dog that, you saw 5 minutes ago, but like the first time, and I'm like, are you home? Are you home? And I put down the tub of Ben and Jerry's. I'm like, you're home. He's like, you need to do something with people. You need to do something with people. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take that. Feedback is fuel. And so, to answer your question, I went kicking and screaming. And as I say, everything I've ever let go of has claw marks all over it, like claw marks from that Ben and Jerry's tub to starting the journey to where I am now. And this is why coactive community is part of being a possibilist. One of the reasons why is I did it as a result of community. So I had people in that year saying, can you come in and mentor? Can you come in and do some coaching? I wasn't a coach in my career, right? I hadn't done any of that. And the rhetoric in my mind was like, why would they pay me to do that? Like, what have I got to say about that? Fast forward a decade, people pay me a relatively large sum of money, and I have got a relatively large amount of things to say about that. But it was as a result, very specifically, and to this day I'm grateful for her, for a friend of mine who was very senior in talent management. And she said, you're coming in, you're doing a session with another organization, you're going to kind of come in and co-facilitate. This is how much you're going to charge. I want you to invoice me by the end of the week. And this is what the session looks like. Now go and talk to him and you guys figure it out. And I was like, just kicking and screaming. And so it went from there. And then that's really, to answer your question about how did I sort of start to quiet and change those stories and that narrative, then what was the same thing that had enticed me, and I imagine it's similar for you, Dom, because in most of the actors I've spoken to, it's a similar sense of just absolute curiosity about the human experience. It hadn't, the embers were there in my financial career, and certainly I was leading teams and I was working with other human beings, but now it was like the billows were like, oh, whoa, okay, yes, there is something here for me to explore. And that curiosity, again, why is clean curiosity a principle of the possibilist? It's like, oh, okay, when I can center myself in that, and I did, and I just absorbed and learned. What I will say to the female piece in the male-dominated environment is, what was interesting is I did what I see so many women do now, and men to a lesser degree that I see it, is I thought I'd better get lots of credentials. I need to go and train as an executive coach. I need to do the cognitive bias training. I need to go and do psychometric profile training. I need to get lots of certificates now. And that for a while became the crutch of why the noise lessened.
You've used that word curiosity a lot, and I think it's a really important kind of mindset to have, to always be seeking things out and to be aware and to be open. when you went on that kind of initial journey into coaching, what were the things that kind of piqued your curiosity, or the people that piqued your curiosity? Were there specific practitioners and mentors that you had in those early days?
Absolutely. And that's also part of the coactive community piece, because I was doing a lot more training and facilitating than I was coaching and speaking for those first few years. And I'm looking around because I'm sure I've got something floating around. I made copious notes listening to other trainers and facilitators. And, because often we would be co-facilitating sessions, or they would do their session and I would watch, and then I'd get up and do mine. And I was, again, what's interesting is I thought I was less than. So I was like, okay, but like, listen to them because they're the kind of auditioning for the main role. I'm like, well, they've got the main role and I'm just the supporting act, right? That's where it was coming from, but also from a place of curiosity in terms of, oh, wow, there's something really amazing here that we can do with human beings, which again tied through to the same purpose that I had as an actress. And the thing that started to really captivate me was when I started seeing people in that space who were speaking not just to the, in banking, there was sometimes a sense of like, oh God, it's like another HR fluff thing that we have to go to, where they're going to tell us how to be and how to behave. Where it wasn't that it was grounded in scientific research and the science of human behavior. And that started to really pique my curiosity, which was then amplified through the whole, when I talk about it, I do feel a bit cliched in the I nearly died situation. I'm like, oh, she's one of those speakers. She nearly died and then she had an epiphany. But to speak to what we're speaking to now, what happened after that, nearly dying thing. Spoiler alert, I survived. That was amplified. Then that what's going on in the dark inside my skull that is creating my experience became absolutely the fascination. And to the point where I said, when I was an actress, I'm like, hello, stranger on the street, you know that you can be an actor and they'll pay you for it. I became like that with neuroscience, and you've interviewed the amazing Dr. Linda Shaw. She's one of the people I studied under, another amazing female neuroscientist in Australia. Again, I got more credentials. I was like, get some credentials. That became an absolute explosion of exploration for me, in terms of I would want to tap people on the shoulder and say, you can figure out what's going on inside your skull. That's like not a secret. Like you can actually study that and literally the science of what is creating your experience. And so then that became kind of a focus and continues to be a big part of our work. But and we'll probably come to talk about it more, but that has really shifted in the last 4 years significantly.
You use the term possibilist, which I love. For people that are new to it, what does it mean, and how can I become one?
Well, it's interesting that we were talking about curiosity, and you'll see it up there actually, because where it started was this realization that we have the ability to be, well, I'll ask you, how would you finish that phrase? Be more curious than
you were yesterday.
Yeah. I love asking my kids this as well. One of them said, be more curious than a 7-year-old. Right. Where it started was, we have the ability, because what I realized was the common denominator in my experience and the experience of people, whether it was from the training facilitating years or then more into the coaching years, and certainly now as a speaker, was, we're afraid. There's fear. And what I knew through my neuroscience certification studies, exploration, is actually we can't be fearless. right? Unless we have damage to the amygdala, unless we actually have some form of brain damage, we cannot be fearless. So as much as, there's amazing speakers who talk about being fearless, Amy Edmondson has literally called building a fearless organization. For me, what I realized was, actually, if what I'm trying to do is be fearless, it's a bit like trying to be confident, right? It just didn't marry up. So what I realized, though, is we have this ability to be more curious than afraid. And so then I started to research what curiosity was and how that showed up differently, even when we were afraid, which had been my experience. I'm like, when I was more curious than afraid, that's where action came from, right? And where there's action, there's change, right? And then I'm going to be growing, right? And moving hopefully towards something that it is that I want in the world, whether it's something I want to create or something I want to experience. And so that's really at the crux of it. And then that evolved into, so what I don't need to be is really positive all the time, because curiosity isn't positive or negative. And so that led me down this research into the strategies that seemed to be the only things that people were talking about. You were either an optimist, and I do this now in my talks, it's like get people to self-nominate. Like, what are you? An optimist, a pessimist, a realist, or particularly for female audiences, a perfectionist. And I break down why those strategies don't work. And one of the reasons that I got so curious about that is because there was a disconnect between how people saw me and how I experienced myself. So, for example, people just, you're so positive, you're so optimistic, you're so, and I'm like, oh no, like, now they're 9 and 7. Like, I would wake up some mornings and I was not that. Right, I was not that. So that, in psychology, we call that cognitive dissonance, right? Now there's a disconnect between how people are seeing me and how I'm experiencing myself. And I'm like, okay, so this optimist thing is not true for me. And then, oh my God, and then I saw it more than ever with clients through the whole pandemic, was they were trying to lead as optimists. Right. And I was on coaching calls with them and they're like, well, I did this session and I was really upbeat and I wanted them to know we were all together and we were going to figure it out and we were going to get to the light at the end of the tunnel. I was trying to point them in the direction of the silver lining. I was like, yeah, well, there's a reason they're not responding to that, because you don't believe that to be true. And you're trying to pep talk yourself through life, which I had tried to do for decades. Come on, Geets, it's okay. You can do this audition. You're good enough for this. Doesn't matter that you don't look Australian, all the things I was making up in my head to try and then make it positive. Okay, don't think like that. Think positively. You can do this. It's exhausting. And so I knew that an optimist was not the way that we are designed. And so then it led me to explore, okay, well, is it a pessimist? They're 100% of the time they're right. Absolutely. Absolutely. It works as a strategy, right? Yeah. We have negativity bias, right? So it's already there in the science of things. And then I thought, wow, is that the design of the system? Have I been designed to create a human experience from a place of better always make sure I've got my parachute on? Like the optimist, designs the plane and the parachute is designed by the pessimist. Like, surely that can't be the strategy. Right? Because that's incredibly draining. And I talk about that in my work now, actually, as the BMW. And if anyone from BMW is listening to this, you are a fantastic organization. I hope to work with you one day. In my world, the way that I talk about it, that became so obvious to me as a result of actually when I first moved to London, because I would come into the office here and it seemed to be an average about the first 7 minutes, people were talking about the weather. And I realized that, yeah, and it was very negative. And actually then the summer came and they still talked for 7 minutes about the weather and it was still negative. Like, why are the tubes so hot? Air conditioning. It's ridiculous. And so now fast forward, and in my work, and one of the things that we talk about with our clients is the BMW, which is bitching, moaning, and whinging. Right? So it is part of the design of the system, right? Just like being an optimist, like some days it's going to be like, wow, yes. And some days it's going to be like, And then I thought, okay, well, maybe like thinking about that, like, then this is really about being a realist. Like, just say it as it is. And then, oh my gosh, you do not have to scratch the surface far, my friend, to see the fragility of that strategy. Because if I'm a realist and I'm saying it as it is, then all I'm doing is documenting what's in front of me. And you don't have to be in the area of innovation or inspiring leadership or connected teams or growth companies to know that if you're only spending your time documenting what's in front of you, then there's no room for growth. There's no room for surprise. There's no room for possibility. And so then I was like, well, I've always been a perfectionist. And at that time, I was calling myself a recovering perfectionist, because I recognized that that's not good anymore to be a perfectionist. Because, as great as it is on an interview to say, oh, what's your weakness? Well, I am a perfectionist, so I'm really always going to be putting in my best. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's not a strategy that's worked for me, because that has held me back and crushed me down and ripped out who I thought I was, to such a degree that I was showing up in such, authenticity is an overused word for me because it's lost its truth. I wasn't being authentic. So then I'm like, okay, well, if we're not any of those things, this word just occurred to me in terms of, those like 2:59 a.m. moments that are normally filled with what I call rabbits jumping up and down in your mind. I was like, oh, actually, back to our point about presence. Like, when I'm present, and it doesn't matter if I'm positive or negative, then I see possibilities. And so is it possible that I'm a possibilist? And what might that look like? And then I got really curious about that. And so now there's 8 C's that are a heck of a lot more fun to explore than confidence, and turns out are the design of the system so that we can create whatever it is that we want in our lives, in a way that is not dependent on remaining positive or avoiding negativity or being realistic about a situation, let alone perfect about it.
That's amazing. If I'm sitting, with my tub of Ben and Jerry's, feeling that things aren't going the way that I want them to go, have you got any kind of practical tools for people to use to become more curious, to spark that, because it's all very well saying, be more curious, but what can I do to help develop that as a skill and as an approach?
I mean, one of the things, and it's always on my desk because it's never far from my mind, is it's very, very difficult in a snowstorm to see things clearly. Right. So if we go outside and it's a heavy snowstorm, which, I loved as an Australian, when I moved here, I was like, oh my God, it gets the snow. Turns out it's really, really difficult to navigate through that. And so if you're sitting at home and you're in that threesome with Ben and Jerry and you're trying to figure it out and you feel in the depths, the very first thing is to realize that you are creating a snowstorm of thinking that has such a heaviness and an opaqueness about it, that once you realize that, and we don't always realize that, because what I saw to be true is I just thought that was the way that I was designed, like such noise in my head. And so the very first thing is to say, I'm creating a snowstorm and expecting to be able to figure it out. Whereas when the snow settles, and isn't it divine, and isn't it so curious how uplifted people are when the snow settles, right? And how they can't talk about it enough, but not in the BMW. How beautiful it is, how pristine it is, how fresh it is, how clean it is, how vast it seems when the snow settles. And I remember going to Prague and it snowed overnight, and I was looking out of this window of this little B&B, and I just was like, wow, suddenly it seemed more expansive, it seemed more vast. And it's the same for our thinking. So that would be the first thing that I would say. And then there are 3 things that I learned 4 years ago. Thank goodness that my path crossed with my now mentor, Michael Neal, which was in a bid to go deeper, funnily enough, with my own clients. I knew there was something else, Dom. I knew there was something else. I'd done the neuroscience. I'd done all of this. I'm like, there's something else. And obviously, you know, when you nearly die, back to that old chestnut, you know, you get really curious about what it is, not to be alive, but to come alive. And so there was something else. And again, I did the like, oh, what else? What other certifications can I do? Maybe it's emotional intelligence 2.0, etc. And so I came across Michael's work, and that has informed, well, it just totally transformed who I was as a person for myself, let alone as a parent, as a daughter, as a CEO, as a leader, as a coach, as a wife. And so then that has absolutely informed, you know, my continued exploration into what it is to be a possibilist, and what I teach and what my coaches teach in terms of the work that we do. The point is, when I'm sort of asked, like, well, what are the 3 things, you know, what are the things? It's kind of 4, if you will. One is like, just wait a minute. It will settle, because the design of the system is for it to settle when I notice that it's not. The snow will always settle. And now I want to talk about climate change, and maybe it won't. No. But the 3 things, if nothing else, that just like, for me, and I say this to anyone that's listening as an experiment, which is what we do as Possiblists, right? We experiment, we fail, we observe, we go again, right? And if we're not failing, then we're not learning. And if we're not learning, then we're not growing. So the 3 things were this: 100% of my feeling is coming from 100% of my thinking. It didn't have anything to do with those women that were bitching about me. It had to do with my thinking about, God, am I good enough? Is that what they think about me? Shit, they must really disrespect. Like, maybe it's because I didn't go to, you know, Cambridge. Like, it came from my own thinking. And I say that as an experiment. Like, go and test that for yourself. And when I saw the truth of that, I was like, oh my God, it was so liberating, Dom. Because that meant what? That I had 100% control over my own experience. And I had spent decades feeling like I was at the mercy of how much I weighed, what I looked like, whether I was a female, a male, went to this university, didn't. I was like, oh my God, I have 100% control. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, a feeling only lasts as long as a thought. So if you're sitting there and you're like, I'm going to go for one more caramel choo-choo tub, like, the feeling that's coming with that is only going to last as long as the thought. And so again, I was like, oh, and my thinking will pass. And here was the just so many game-changing kind of realizations, and really enlightenment and awakening, and thereby wanting to create more light in other people's worlds, was, what if I didn't need to believe my thinking? So, okay, I think I'm shit. I think that, you know, I'm in this place because I deserve to be in this place, because I was kind of faking it the whole time, because finally I was found out, because, you know, I was never going to make it as an actor. It's like, oh, what if I don't need to believe that thinking? And then if I wait long enough, the snow's going to settle, the thinking's going to pass, and I don't need to do anything for that to happen. I don't need to like pep talk myself into it. And so then from there, some possibilities begin to peek through, like little rays through the, you know, you've got the curtains closed, it's dark, it's heavy in your mind. It's like, what if? And then if we hold that space, that light for long enough, disrupt what is just accidental habitual thinking, that's where the possibilities come thick and fast. And that's where not the confidence, but the curiosity to take action on them comes.
If we take that and we put it into a kind of, a pitch environment, whether that's a sales pitch or, I'm going for a promotion and I want to convince people that I'm the right person for the job. What mistakes do you see people making, and how can they retrain their focus in order to get better results in those sorts of environments?
Mm. One of the biggest things I see people doing, and I did it for myself for decades, is trying really hard. Right? So we have it here, one of our postcards with the coaching experiment on the back says, try less.
Right.
When we're trying, you know me, like it's very disruptive the way that we are and unconventional, which is why I love our work. Actually, when I'm trying to win business, when I'm trying to influence someone, when I'm trying to convince someone, whether that's a 9-year-old or a 39-year-old in a business suit, then that has taken me completely out of what is available to me to actually create the outcome that I want. And so there are some very obvious things that we point people in the direction of really fast so that they can get to grips with it quickly. And one of them I call LTTR is what's your listen to talk ratio? And in my experience, particularly from a sales perspective, it doesn't matter what industry you are in, and hello speakers, is like the talk ratio is skewed.
Yeah.
Right? So actually that as a very tangible, and again, it's really interesting to me because I was not into science at all. And you can ask Mr. Heath, my physics teacher, I'm like, but actually we've now quantum physics, don't even get me started. Massive area of fascination, curiosity, and research for my work. But actually what we do is we've ended up in this scientific method as Possiblists is like observe, right? Hypothesize, experiment, analyze, and go again, right? So in that situation, it's like, well, let me just observe my LTTR, right? And there's no right or wrong. We're not here to do right or wrong, right?
Yeah.
It's like, let me just observe it. And then within that, what we point people in the direction of is, how much of the talk is statements versus questions?
Interesting.
Right? Oftentimes, again, when we are in that position, we're trying to tell people how great it's going to be for them, right? And that is coming from a place of truth, right? And you know that in your own work, it's like, and oh my God, talk about evangelical. I'm like, I've got the answer, people. Like literally wanting to be on the soapbox with the other guy, from the Mormons on the corner going, yes, I know the truth. You can live the life that you want without the stress, the fear, the worry, the anxiety, the overwhelm. I'm like, okay, you mean just telling people that isn't the path to enlightenment, right? And if what we are actually asking people to do when we're pitching to them in a more traditional business setting is to be enlightened, as in enlightened, light from within, then they're switching that on themselves. We're just the catalyst for pointing their finger in the direction of the light switch. And the way that we can do that, as far as I can see it, is by asking really incredible questions, right? And then what I call infinite wisdom is alive. And then from there, you're getting that all important data and information as a salesperson or whoever you are trying to pitch something. And then from there, I call it the and then mindset, right? Rather than if then. If I say this, then they do this. If I present this way, then this will happen. If I don't think this, then this will happen. The algorithms of the mind are as unreliable as the algorithms of Instagram. I mean, you're on social media. I'm like, I don't know what's going on from one day to the next. Like, I'm certainly not going to do life that way in terms of my mind. And again, I had done, and I see clients doing it. So then what we're pointing them in the direction of is and then mindset. So really at the core of being a possibilist, I mean, so much at the core, it's a big core, is and then, right? Oh, I asked this and then, right? I'm staying in that space in what I call the gap between where I am and where I want to be. The longer I stay in that gap of the unknown, the greater the possibilities. And to the point about, I'm not a fan of particularly the what do you do question. But I said to a client actually recently, we were talking about the unknown, her relationship with the unknown. She's a very senior equity partner in a consulting firm here in London, and what that meant about, how she was showing up, like strategically, what that meant in terms of the value she was adding, like all of what I call the downstream elements of what it is to be in life. And I said, the next time someone asks me what I do, I am going to say, I am the CEO of a PR agency, and we only have one client. And they're going to say, oh, who's that? And I'm going to say, the unknown. Are you familiar with them? They have a really poor reputation. And as a PR agency, we are in the business of rebranding the unknown, right? So, and speaking of unknown.
Gitanjali, I could talk to you all day about this sort of stuff, but I do have one final question before we wrap up. If you could go back and give that 6-year-old girl who was watching that theatre show one piece of advice, what would it be?
You are whole. You are complete. You can never be broken. And everything you need is within you.
Amazing. Gitanjali, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you. That was fun. Thanks, Dom.
Thanks for listening to the Why Life's a Pitch podcast. If you'd like to improve the way you pitch and communicate, I'm giving away a special gift to all my listeners. We've developed the Pitching with Impact scorecard to help you benchmark your pitch performance in 6 key areas. It'll take you less than 5 minutes to complete, and you'll receive a detailed, personalised report packed full of insights and ideas to help you improve and grow. Just head over to dominiccolenso.com/scorecard to get started.